In the unforgiving dust of the Arizona Territory, some bargains are sealed not with a handshake, but with a soul. For Jessamine Bellwether, a woman shackled by her late father's debts, the choice was simple and monstrous. She could surrender her family's ranch to the most ruthless cattle baron in the county, or she could accept a fate worse than destitution in the eyes of everyone she knew. The baron, a man with a heart of pure granite, offered a third way, a cruel joke meant to break her spirit. She could keep her land if only she would agree to marry the one man nobody dared to cross the silent, towering giant who lived as an outcast beyond the town's edge, the half-Apache they called Dante. What the baron meant as the ultimate humiliation, however, would ignite a story of courage, defiance, and a love no one ever saw coming. The air in the Redemption Gap saloon was thick enough to taste a foul cocktail of stale whiskey sweat and the fine red dust that seeped through the very walls of the building. It was a man's world, and Jessamine Bellwether felt every one of their glares like a physical touch. Her calico dress, though clean, was frayed at the cuffs, and her late father's ledger was clutched in her hand so tightly her knuckles were bone white. Across the scarred wooden table sat Bartholomew Creed, a man whose wealth was matched only by his cruelty. His face was a roadmap of scowling lines, and his eyes, small and dark, held the cold gleam of a predator. The long and short of it, Miss Bellwether Creed, said his voice, a low rumble that cut through the saloon's din, is that your father, bless his foolish heart, was a better dreamer than he was a rancher. He owed me $500. The note is due. The ranch, the Bellwether Star, is the collateral. Jessamine's throat was dry. I've asked for an extension, Mr. Creed. The spring roundup was poor. With more time is a luxury I don't afford, he sneered, leaning back in his chair. He gestured a thick, ringed finger around the room. These men, they understand business. A debt is a debt. He paused, letting his gaze drift over her, an appraisal that made her skin crawl. Of course, there are other ways to settle a debt. Her chin lifted a spark of defiance in her weary green eyes. I will not be your whore, sir. A wave of ugly laughter rippled through the onlookers. Creed's lips twisted into a smirk. Such fire. No, I'm a man of propriety. I was thinking of a more permanent arrangement. A marriage unites our lands, secures my investment. You'd be Mrs. Creed, a respectable position. The offer hung in the air, putrid and suffocating. Marry this monster, become his property, to be used and discarded. The thought was more terrifying than starvation. She could feel the weight of her father's legacy, the small patch of land he had poured his life into, slipping through her fingers. I cannot, she whispered, the words tasting like ash. Creed's smirk widened. He had expected this. He wanted her to refuse. He wanted the land free and clear. He leaned forward, a malicious glint in his eyes, as a new, crueler idea took shape. Very well, he said, his voice loud enough for the entire saloon to hear. You reject my generous offer. You have no money. You have no prospects. But I am not without a certain flair for the dramatic. He pointed a thumb toward the swinging doors, just as a massive figure passed by the window, casting a long, intimidating shadow into the room. You see that man out there? The half-breed, Dante Creed, announced, his voice dripping with scorn. Lives like a savage in the hills. Bigger than a draft horse and twice as mean, they say. Not a soul in this town would share a drink with him, let alone a bed. The men muttered, some shifting uncomfortably, others nodding in agreement. Dante was a local legend, a figure of fear and speculation. His father was a white trapper, long gone, and his mother, a San Carlos Apache woman, long since passed. He kept to himself, trading exquisitely carved wooden figures and perfect pelts for the bare necessities, his silence and immense stature, a constant source of unease for the townsfolk. Creed's eyes locked onto Jessamine's, the final venomous stroke of his plan delivered with relish. "I'll tell you what, Miss Bellwether. You want to keep your father's precious dirt so badly. Here is my final offer. The debt is forgiven. The ranch is yours, free and clear. All you have to do is marry him." A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. It wasn't a deal. It was a public shaming. A sentence. He was offering to chain her not to a man, but to the town's boogeyman. He expected her to recoil in horror, to break down, to finally relent and either marry him or sign over the deed. Jessamine stared at Creed, the blood draining from her face. She saw the smug certainty in his eyes, the leering faces of the men around him. They were all waiting for her to crumble. She thought of her father's grave on the hill, overlooking the ranch, of the promise she'd made to never let it go. She looked past Creed through the grimy window and saw Dante walking down the street. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace that seemed at odds with his towering frame. He wasn't menacing. He was just alone. In that moment, a strange and desperate resolve hardened within her. She was being offered a choice between two monsters. One was a man who hid his rotten soul behind a veneer of wealth and power. The other was a man she didn't know, feared only for his blood and his size. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Jessamine Bellwether looked Bartholomew Creed dead in the eye. Her voice, though quiet, rang with the clarity of a newly forged bell in the stunned silence. "I accept." The silence in the saloon shattered into a cacophony of disbelieving murmurs and sharp, cruel laughter. Bartholomew Creed's jaw went slack, the smug satisfaction wiped clean from his face, replaced by a flicker of genuine shock. He had orchestrated a checkmate, only to have his opponent knock over the board and walk away. "You—" what he stammered. "You heard me, Mr. Creed." Jessamine repeated her voice, gaining strength. "You made an offer in front of witnesses. I accept it. My father's debt is forgiven, and I will marry Dante." Creed's face purpled with rage. He was trapped by his own hubris. To back down now would make him look like a fool. His foreman, a hulking brute named Hank Dawson, stepped forward. "Boss, you can't be serious. Letting her do this." Quiet Hank Creed seethed through gritted teeth. His eyes, burning with fury, darted to the town's part-time preacher and justice of the peace, a nervous little man named Gregory Pike, who was trying to make himself invisible in a corner. "Pike, you heard it. It's a contract. Get it done." The task of fetching Dante fell to Sheriff Brody, a man worn down by the town's casual cruelties. He found the giant near the livery trading a set of carved songbirds for a sack of flour. Dante listened to the sheriff's explanation without a single change in his stoic expression. His face, framed by long dark hair, was a mask of hard angles and quiet sorrow. His eyes, the color of dark roast coffee, held a depth that made most men look away. He simply nodded, once shouldered the flour, and followed Brody back to the saloon. The wedding was the most humiliating event Redemption Gap had ever witnessed. It wasn't held in the modest church, but right there in the saloon, the air still smelling of whiskey and Creed's fury. Jessamine stood stiffly, her hands clasped in front of her, her gaze fixed on a dirty spot on the wall behind Preacher Pike's head. She refused to look at the jeering crowd. Dante stood beside her. The top of her head barely reached his shoulder. He wore simple buckskin trousers and a linen shirt, clean but worn. He did not look at her either. His focus seemed to be on the floorboards, his posture utterly still, a mountain of a man enduring a storm. He smelled of pine needles, leather and clean earth, a stark contrast to the saloon's stench. Preacher Pike stumbled through the vows, his voice trembling. Do you— Jessamine Bellwether, take this man. Dante, to be your lawfully wedded husband. Jessamine's voice was a dry whisper. I do. And do you, Dante? Pike had to crane his neck to look up at him. Take this woman. A long, heavy silence descended. Dante did not speak. For a terrifying moment, Jessamine thought he would refuse, that this whole nightmare was for nothing. Then he gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. He nods, Pike declared with relief. By the authority vested in me by the Arizona Territory, I pronounce you man and wife. There was no kiss, no congratulations, only a fresh wave of snickering. Creed slammed a bottle of whiskey on the bar. A toast, he roared his voice, thick with sarcasm. To the happy couple may their union be as beautiful as it is fitting. Dante turned his dark eyes, finally meeting Jessamine's. There was no anger in them, no malice. There was nothing she could read at all, which was somehow more frightening. He gestured with his head toward the door. It was time to go. He had come to town with a pack mule. He loaded her single trunk, containing all her worldly possessions, onto its back, with an ease that was startling. He didn't offer her a hand up onto the mule's saddle. He simply assumed she could manage. She did her body moving with a rigid pride that was her only defense. As they left Redemption Gap behind, every window and doorway seemed to hold a pair of staring, judgmental eyes. Jessamine didn't look back. She fixed her gaze on the broad, straight back of the man walking in front of her, the man who was now her husband. The trail led away from the familiar dusty track and up into the rocky, juniper-studded hills that bordered the territory of the Apache. The journey was made in absolute silence. The only sounds were the plodding hooves of the mule, the crunch of Dante's boots on the gravel, and the whisper of the wind through the sagebrush. With every step that took her further from her old life, a cold dread seeped deeper into Jessamine's bones. She had escaped Bartholomew Creed's grasp, but what had she fallen into? The stories about Dante flooded her mind. They said he was savage, that he talked to spirits, that he could snap a man's neck with one hand. She was a woman educated at a ladies' seminary back east, who knew more about poetry than she did about survival. Now she belonged to him. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple. The shadows grew long and menacing. She was alone, utterly and completely with a stranger, feared by all headed to a home she couldn't begin to imagine. The trail grew steeper, winding through canyons of red rock that glowed like embers in the fading light. Jessamine's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She expected a crude lean-to, a smoky wickiup, or at best a squalid one-room shack. The reality, when it appeared, stunned her into silence. Nestled in a small sheltered mesa, protected from the harsh winds by a crescent of stone cliffs, was a cabin. It wasn't a shack. It was a home. It was built of sturdy, expertly notched pine logs with a wide porch and a roof of carefully laid shakes. A plume of smoke curled from a stone chimney, and in a small, fenced-in corral, a pair of goats and a sturdy-looking horse regarded their approach with mild curiosity. A small, meticulously tended garden grew nearby, filled with corn, squash, and beans. Dante led the mule to the corral, and with an economy of motion, unsaddled it and rubbed it down before turning it loose. He then lifted her trunk off its back as if it were a feather pillow and carried it toward the cabin. He opened the door and stood aside, a silent invitation for her to enter. Hesitantly, Jessamine dismounted and walked across the porch. The interior of the cabin was a single large room, but it was the antithesis of the squalor she had braced herself for. It was spotlessly clean. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, a pot of something savory simmering over a low fire. A sturdy table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the room. A bookshelf filled with worn volumes was a sight so unexpected it made her gasp. But it was the bed that held her attention. There was only one, a large frame covered with a thick mattress of straw and a pile of soft, clean furs. Her throat tightened. This was the reality of her bargain. Dante placed her trunk at the foot of the bed. He then moved to the fireplace, ladled some of the stew into a wooden bowl, and placed it on the table, along with a spoon and a piece of cornbread. He did not make a bowl for himself. He simply took a dipper of water from a bucket and went to stand on the porch, his back to the open door, looking out at the star-dusted sky. He was giving her space. He was letting her eat first. Confused, Jessamine sat down. The stew was rich with venison and wild vegetables, and despite her anxiety, she was famished. She ate slowly, every nerve on edge, listening to the sounds of the night. When she was finished, she washed her bowl in a basin of water near the door. Still, Dante didn't come inside. He remained on the porch, a silent, unmoving silhouette against the night. Was he going to stay out there all night? Summoning a sliver of courage, she walked to the doorway. "Thank you for the meal," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He turned his head slightly, acknowledging her words with a slight inclination. Where will you be sleeping?" she asked, the question hanging awkwardly between them. He looked from her to the bed, then to the floor beside the hearth, where a thick bearskin rug lay. He pointed to the rug. She stared at him, bewildered. He was the giant, the savage, her husband by law. He had every right in the eyes of the world to claim his place in that bed. Yet he was offering it to her, all of it, and taking the floor for himself. It was a gesture of such profound and unexpected decency that it completely disarmed her. "No," she found herself saying. That is not right. It is your home. You should take the bed." For the first time, he turned to face her fully in the dim light from the doorway. He looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face, and she saw not a savage but a man carrying a great and weary weight. He spoke, his voice a low, gravelly sound, unused to forming many words. "You are not here by choice. I will not force more on you." He then walked past her, into the cabin, picked up a spare blanket, and laid it on the bearskin rug. Without another word, he lay down, turned his back to her, and became as still as the stone of the mountain. Jessamine stood in the doorway for a long time, the cool night air raising goosebumps on her arms. Nothing was as she had expected. There was no brute, no monster. There was only a quiet, lonely man who had shown her more courtesy and respect in a few hours than Bartholomew Creed had shown her in a lifetime. She finally closed the door, the solid thud echoing the closing of a chapter of her life. She changed into her nightgown, her fingers fumbling with the buttons. As she slipped into the bed beneath the warm, soft furs that smelled faintly of cedar and sage, she felt a confusion of emotions. Fear was still there, a low thrum beneath the surface, but it was now joined by a bewildering sense of curiosity, and something else, something she couldn't name. It felt impossibly like a flicker of safety. She lay awake for hours, listening to the gentle rhythm of her giant husband's breathing from the floor, a sound that was not menacing, but steady and calm, like the heartbeat of the mountain itself. The days that followed fell into a strange, silent rhythm. Dante would rise before the sun, his movements quiet so as not to wake her. He would tend to the animals, work his small plot of land, and then disappear into the hills for hours, returning with game or medicinal herbs. Jessamine, a woman raised to manage a household, found herself with little to do. The cabin was always clean, the firewood always stocked. She took to tending the garden, her hands finding solace in the feel of the earth. She explored the bookshelf, finding worn copies of Shakespeare philosophical treatises and detailed books on botany, all in English. The discovery baffled her. Who was this man? He rarely spoke. Their communication was one of gestures. A nod toward the water bucket, when it was low a piece of fresh honeycomb left on the table for her breakfast. But in his silence she began to see him. She saw the gentleness with which he treated his animals, whispering to the horse in a low, soothing tone. She saw the patience in his hands as he repaired a fence post, and the deep, abiding knowledge of the land in the way he moved through it. One afternoon, seeking refuge from the heat, she found him sitting in the shade behind the cabin, a block of cottonwood in one hand and a small, sharp knife in the other. He was carving. With deft, precise movements, he was coaxing a shape from the wood. She watched, mesmerized, as a hawk, wings outstretched, emerged from the block. The detail was breathtaking, every feather etched with perfect clarity, the head cocked as if listening to the wind. His workshop was a small, shaded alcove. Dozens of finished carvings sat on a makeshift shelf. There were deer, bears, eagles, and coyotes, each so life-minded it seemed they might spring to life. But there were other, more poignant figures. A woman with a gentle face, her hair in long braids holding a baby. An old man, his face a web of wrinkles staring at the horizon. These were not just animals. They were stories, memories rendered in wood. This was his language. A week after her arrival, their supply of flour ran low. The trip to Redemption Gap was unavoidable. Jessamine felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. Dante simply nodded when she told him, and the next morning they rode down from the mesa together, this time with him on his horse and her on the mule. The town's reaction was even worse than she had imagined. As they walked toward the general store, conversation stopped. People stared their faces, a mixture of contempt and hostile curiosity. Women pulled their children closer. Men spat tobacco juice near her feet. It was as if she were tainted a pariah by association. Inside the store, the proprietor, a man named Henderson, who had known her father for 20 years, treated her with cold formality. "What do you need?" he asked, his eyes refusing to meet hers. As she listed her supplies, Hank Dawson and two of Creed's other ranch hands swaggered in. Dawson's eyes, small and piggy, lit up with malice when he saw her. "Well, well, look what the cat dragged in." Dawson sneered loud enough for the whole store to hear. "Enjoying your new accommodations?" Mrs. Dante Jessamine ignored him, her back ramrod straight. Dante, who had been standing silently by the door, took a half-step forward, his presence filling the room. He said nothing, but the air crackled with a sudden tension. Dawson, emboldened by his companions, continued his taunts. "Must be nice up on that rock. Plenty of peace and quiet, and plenty of water, I hear. Funny, ain't it? Every other creek in the county is bone dry, but old man Bellwether's land always had a trickle. Creed's cattle are getting mighty thirsty." He's starting to think he was too generous in his deal. The mention of water struck a chord in Jessamine's memory. Her father had always been secretive about their well, warning her never to let it run dry, muttering about how it was the lifeblood of the ranch. At the time, she had thought it was just a rancher's typical concern. Now Dawson's words gave it a sinister new meaning. "That is our business, Mr. Dawson," Jessamine said, her voice cold. Is it Dawson took a menacing step closer. "Creed gets what he wants. Always. He wanted your land. He still wants it. And a sham marriage to a red-skinned giant ain't gonna stop him." Before he could take another step, Dante moved. He didn't rush. He simply flowed from the doorway to stand between Jessamine and Dawson. He didn't touch the foreman. He just stood there, a granite wall of a man. His sheer size was suffocating, and his eyes, now fixed on Dawson, were no longer placid. They burned with a cold, controlled fire. Dawson, for all his bluster, was a coward at heart. He looked up into Dante's unblinking gaze and faltered. He took an involuntary step back, bumping into a barrel of pickles. "This ain't over," he snarled, trying to save face. He and his men backed out of the store, their bravado evaporating into the dusty street. The store was silent. Mr. Henderson quickly finished bagging her supplies. As Jessamine paid, his eyes met hers for a fleeting second, and in them she saw not contempt, but a flicker of pity, and maybe even a grudging respect. The ride back to the mesa was as silent as the first, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer just an absence of words. It was charged with what had happened. He had defended her. He had placed himself between her and danger without hesitation. That evening, as she prepared their meal, she thought about Dawson's words. Creed still wants it. It wasn't just about humiliating her. Creed was after the ranch, and his mention of water was the key. He was a cattle baron. A reliable water source during a drought would be worth more than gold. Her father's land, which she had always seen as modest and hard-scrabble, held a secret prize, and the man who had helped her protect it for now was the silent giant who was at that moment sitting on the porch carving a new figure from a piece of juniper wood. She stepped outside and saw what he was making. It was a woman standing tall, her chin lifted in defiance. It was her. In his silent language, he had seen her not as a victim, but as a fighter. A wave of emotion, so powerful, it almost buckled her knees, washed over her. She hadn't just been saved from Creed. She was beginning to be seen, truly seen, for the first time in her life. Bartholomew Creed was not a man to be trifled with. Thwarted and publicly embarrassed, his obsession with the Bellwether Ranch festered. The drought was worsening, and the whispers of the whispering spring on Jessamine's land, a name she was just beginning to recall from her father's ramblings, were becoming a siren's call for his thirsty herds. He couldn't take the land by law, so he would take it by force, disguised as nature's fury. The plan was simple and brutal. Hank Dawson and a half-dozen men would drive a small herd of Creed's rangiest longhorns up into the canyons above Whisperwind Mesa. At the height of the next big thunderstorm, they would start a stampede, sending hundreds of panicked, thundering hooves down the narrow wash that led directly toward Dante's cabin and the spring's source. In the ensuing chaos, the cabin would be trampled, the garden destroyed, the corral shattered. It would look like a tragic accident. The grieving widow with her home destroyed would have no choice but to sell the now ruined land to the ever-so-helpful Mr. Creed for pennies on the dollar. Jessamine knew none of this. All she knew was that the sky had turned a bruised, sickly yellow. The air grew heavy and still, the kind of oppressive silence that precedes violence. Dante had returned from the hills early, his eyes scanning the horizon. He moved with a new urgency, reinforcing the corral gate and securing the shutters on the cabin. "A storm is coming," he said, one of his rare direct statements. "I know," she replied, helping him lash down a canvas over the firewood pile. "A bad one." The first fat drops of rain began to fall just as dusk settled, and then the sky ripped open. Rain came down not in sheets, but in solid walls of water. Lightning spiderwebbed across the heavens, followed an instant later by cracks of thunder so loud they shook the cabin to its foundations. It was amidst this natural chaos that a new sound began, a low, distant rumble that was not thunder. It was a rhythmic, earth-shaking tremor that grew steadily louder. Dante stiffened, his head cocked. He blew out the lantern, plunging the cabin into near darkness, lit only by the strobing flashes of lightning. "Stay inside," he commanded, his voice a low growl. "Bar the door." He grabbed a heavy rifle from a rack on the wall and was out the door before she could protest. Jessamine rushed to the window, her heart seizing with terror. In the next flash of lightning, she saw it, a terrifying, churning wave of horns, and hides, a river of cattle pouring down the wash, their eyes wide with panic. They were headed straight for the cabin. But they weren't just panicked. She saw riders, dark shapes on horseback, flanking the herd, firing pistols into the air to keep them charging forward. It wasn't the storm. It was Creed. Dante was a blur of motion. He didn't try to stand against the tide. That would be suicide. Instead, he sprinted toward a massive, precariously balanced rock formation at the side of the wash that Jessamine had always thought looked like a sleeping giant. He scrambled up its side with an agility that defied his size. Reaching the top, he put his shoulder to the massive boulder and pushed. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep groan of protest, the rock began to shift. It tipped slowly at first, then with gathering momentum, and crashed down into the wash with the force of a cannonball. It didn't stop the stampede, but it did the next best thing. It split the herd. The main body of the cattle veered away, crashing through the juniper trees and into the wider canyon, while only a dozen or so tumbled past the cabin, one hitting the corner with a sickening crunch of wood. The immediate danger had passed, but in the chaos, one of Dawson's men saw Dante's silhouette on the rocks against a flash of lightning. A rifle shot rang out sharp and clear, even over the storm. Dante cried out a sound of pain that ripped through Jessamine, and then he was gone, tumbling down the far side of the rock formation. Forgetting his order, forgetting her own safety, Jessamine unbarred the door and ran out into the maelstrom. She found him at the base of the rocks, half conscious, a dark stain spreading across his shoulder and a nasty gash on his forehead where he had hit the ground. The riders, their work of destruction incomplete, but their presence revealed, were already retreating into the storm. With strength she didn't know she possessed, she managed to get him to his feet and half drag, half carry him back to the cabin. The corner of the building was splintered, but it had held. She barred the door again and lit the lantern, her hands shaking. The bullet had gone clean through the thick muscle of his shoulder. It was a painful wound, but not a fatal one if she could stop the bleeding and prevent infection. She tore strips from one of her petticoats for bandages. As she worked, cutting away his shirt, her clinical focus gave way to awe and a sharp, painful empathy. His torso was a tapestry of old scars, a long, puckered line across his ribs that looked like it came from a knife, a trio of small, round scars on his back that could only have come from bullets, and fainter, older lines of white across his back that spoke of a whip. This silent, gentle man had endured a lifetime of violence. This was the price he had paid for his blood, for his existence between two worlds that both rejected him. He was conscious, his eyes watching her, as she cleaned the wound with whiskey, her touch surprisingly steady. They were Creed's men, she said, her voice a mixture of fury and fear. Dawson, they tried to kill you, to destroy this place. Dante grunted in agreement, the pain evident on his face. It's the water, she continued, thinking aloud as she tightly bound his shoulder. There's a spring on this land, isn't there one that never runs dry? He nodded. My mother's people called it the heart of the mountain. It is why my father settled here. He traded for this land, fair and square. She finished the bandage and then gently cleaned the gash on his forehead. Her fingers brushed his temple, and for a moment their eyes met. The carefully constructed walls between them seemed to dissolve in the flickering lantern light. Your father, she began tentatively. What happened to him? Dante's gaze shifted to the fire, a deep sadness welling in his eyes. His name was Jacob Kane. He was a good man. He believed in the law. When Bartholomew Creed's father tried to claim this land, Jacob went to the marshal. He had the deed. He was ambushed on the way back. Murdered. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, as if the pain was so old it had been worn smooth. I was 10. Creed's father and his men came here. They called my mother a squaw, called me a half-breed animal. They beat her. They whipped me when I tried to fight them. Jessamine's breath caught in her throat, the scars on his back. They left us for dead, he continued. But my mother was strong. She knew the old ways. She healed us. But her spirit was broken. She died 2 winters later. I have been here alone ever since. This land is all I have of them. Tears streamed down Jessamine's face, silent tears of grief for the boy he had been and the man he had become. She had seen him as a shield, a solution to her problem. Now she saw him as a man who had suffered an injustice far greater than her own, a man who had been defending his home, his legacy, his entire world for years. Without thinking, she reached out and laid her hand on his uninjured arm. His skin was warm, his muscles tense beneath her touch. He looked at her, his expression unreadable but for the deep well of pain in his eyes. "You are not alone anymore," she whispered. In the quiet of the storm-battered cabin, a new and powerful alliance was forged, no longer a bargain of convenience, but a bond sealed by shared history and a common, ruthless enemy. They weren't just husband and wife, they were survivors, and they would face what was coming together. The failed stampede hardened Bartholomew Creed's resolve into a diamond-sharp point of fury. His plan had not only failed to dislodge the happy couple, it had revealed his hand. Sheriff Brody had ridden out the next day, drawn by rumors of the stampede. He'd looked at the tracks at the splintered cabin at Dante's bandaged shoulder, and then at Jessamine's resolute face. Brody was a weary man, but not a corrupt one. "This has Creed's stink all over it," Brody had said. "But I can't prove a thing without a witness who'll talk, and his men are paid too well for that." He looked from Dante to Jessamine. "You watch your backs. Creed's like a cornered snake now." His warning was unnecessary. A new energy coursed through the cabin on Whisperwind Mesa. The silence between Jessamine and Dante was no longer one of awkwardness, but of shared purpose. She cared for his wound, changing the dressing, and making him potent herbal teas she learned about from one of his botany books. In turn, he began to speak, more sharing stories of the land, teaching her to read the signs of the weather, to identify edible plants. He taught her how to handle the heavy rifle, his large, scarred hands gently guiding hers, showing her how to brace it, how to sight it, how to control her breathing. She was a surprisingly quick study. Her mind, however, was consumed with the past. Dante's story about his father, Jacob Kane, had planted a seed. Her own father had kept meticulous records of everything. If Jacob Kane had a deed, and her father had bought the land from him or his estate, there had to be a paper trail. Her search began in the old trunk Dante had carried up the mountain for her. Beneath her mother's lace and her own few good dresses, she found what she was looking for, her father's old tin lockbox. Inside were her parents' wedding certificate, her own birth record, and a thick folded document tied with a faded ribbon. It was the deed to the Bellwether Star Ranch. Unfolding it, she saw the familiar property lines, the official seals of the territory. But tucked inside, she found another much older piece of paper. It was a hand-drawn map, frail and yellowed with age. On it, a section of the property was marked with a looping, elegant script, Whispering Spring. A dotted line showed its underground path, originating deep within the rocky cliffs on Dante's Mesa, and emerging on what was now her land. But there was more. Tucked into the final fold of the deed was a notarized letter written in her father's hand. Her breath hitched as she read it. To whom it may concern, I, Alistair Bellwether, being of sound mind, do hereby set down the truth of my land's acquisition. The parcel known as Whisperwind Mesa was never mine to own. It was and remains the legal property of Dante, son of Jacob Kane, as per the original deed filed in Prescott in 1858 by his father. When the elder Creed murdered Jacob Kane and drove his wife and child from the main house, he falsified a bill of sale for the entire property. I came upon this land years later, and not knowing the history bought it in good faith. It was only when I discovered the true source of the Whispering Spring that I found Jacob Kane's hidden lockbox containing his original deed and this map. My attempts to find the boy Dante were fruitless for many years. When I finally learned he was living upon the mesa, I was too afraid of the Creed family to come forward and right this wrong. It is the great shame of my life. This letter and the enclosed original deed to Whisperwind Mesa are my confession. The mesa belongs to Dante. May God forgive my cowardice. Jessamine's hands trembled as she pulled out the other document from the envelope. It was the original deed bearing the name Jacob Kane. Dante's father hadn't just been murdered, he had been erased. The Creed family's fortune was built on a foundation of theft and blood. Her own family's ranch was in part stolen land. That evening she laid the documents on the table before Dante. He looked at them, his face unmoving, but she saw the flicker of profound emotion in his dark eyes as he read his father's name on the deed. He picked up the piece of paper with a reverence she had never seen from him, his fingers tracing the name as if he could feel his father's presence in the ink. My father's hand, he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he had suppressed for 2 decades. He looked at Jessamine, and in his gaze she saw the raw, aching heart of the 10-year-old boy who had lost everything. He tried to do it the right way, the white man's way, with paper and laws. And now we will finish it his way, Jessamine said, her voice ringing with conviction. This changes everything, Dante. This isn't just your home, it's your legal right. Creed doesn't just want the water, he's trying to bury a crime his father committed 20 years ago. The air in the cabin was electric. They were no longer just defending a home, they were reclaiming a legacy. The ghost of Jacob Kane had given them the weapon they needed. The fight was no longer about survival. It was about justice. They knew Creed would not let this go. He would hear that Dante had survived, that their plan had failed. He would not send lackeys next time. He would come himself, determined to wipe the slate clean, to silence the last 2 people who knew the truth of his family's bloody ascent to power. Dante took the rifle she had been practicing with and a box of cartridges, placing them in her hands. "He will come soon," Dante said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "And he will not expect you to be ready." Jessamine looked from the rifle to Dante's resolute face. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, burning loyalty and a righteous anger. She was no longer just Jessamine Bellwether, the failed rancher's daughter. She was the wife of Dante, son of Jacob Kane, and she would not let his father's legacy be buried again. The final confrontation came 3 days later at dawn. A lone rider, one of Creed's men, posted as a lookout, had been spotted by Dante the evening before. There would be no more attempts at subtlety, no more manufactured accidents. This was an extermination. Bartholomew Creed rode at the head of a dozen men, including Hank Dawson. They were heavily armed, their faces grim. This was not a cattle drive. It was a war party. As they began the steep ascent to Whisperwind, Mesa Creed felt a surge of triumphant power. He would burn the cabin to the ground, kill the half-breed, and deal with the woman. He would find the old cane lockbox, which he was sure must still be hidden on the property, and destroy the last piece of evidence. The land, the water, and his family's dark secret would all be his. But Dante and Jessamine were not waiting to be slaughtered. They had used the last 2 days to prepare. Dante, using his intimate knowledge of the terrain, had set a series of traps along the main trail, nothing lethal, but designed to sow chaos and separate the riders. A concealed tripwire that would release a cascade of small boulders. A section of the path weakened to crumble under the weight of multiple horses. Jessamine was positioned in a sniper's nest Dante had shown her, a small defensible alcove in the rocks that overlooked the trail 100 yards from the cabin. She had the rifle a full box of ammunition and a clear field of fire. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady. She thought of her father's shame, of Dante's scars, of Jacob Kane's murder. This was for them. The first sign of trouble for Creed's party was when the lead rider's horses screamed as the ground gave way, sending them tumbling. At the same moment, the boulder fall trap was triggered, cutting off the front half of the group from the back. Chaos erupted. Men shouted, horses panicked. From her perch, Jessamine took aim. She didn't shoot to kill. She fired at the rock face just above their heads, sending shards of stone raining down on them, adding to the confusion. Another shot kicked up dust at Hank Dawson's feet, making his horse rear and throw him. Creed, bellowing in rage, saw Jessamine's position. "It's the woman, get her!" he roared, firing his pistol wildly in her direction. But as his men tried to advance, Dante struck. He seemed to materialize from the rocks themselves, not with a rifle, but with a heavy Apache war club in one hand and a bow in the other. He moved with a terrifying speed and silence that the white men accustomed to open-field fights couldn't comprehend. An arrow hissed from the shadows and buried itself in the shoulder of a man aiming at Jessamine. Another took a rider's horse in the flank, sending it careening into 2 others. He was a whirlwind of controlled violence, using the land as his greatest weapon. He was not the quiet gentleman from the cabin. He was a warrior, defending his ancestral home, and he was magnificent. The fight devolved into a frantic, disorganized skirmish. Creed's men were disoriented, separated, and being picked off one by an enemy they could barely see. Jessamine kept up her suppressing fire, forcing them to stay behind cover, preventing them from mounting any organized charge. Finally, only Creed and a wounded Hank Dawson were left cornered behind a rock outcropping. "This is it, Creed." Dante's voice boomed from the cliffs around them, seeming to come from everywhere at once. "You're on Kane land. You will pay for your father's crimes." "Kane is dead," Creed screamed back, his face a mask of sweat and fury. "And you will be too, you savage!" He pushed Dawson out from behind the rock. "Get him!" As Dawson staggered into the open, Jessamine had a clear shot. Her finger tightened on the trigger, but she hesitated. She was not a killer. In that moment of hesitation, Dawson raised his pistol, but before he could fire a different rifle shot, echoed from down the trail a single authoritative crack. Dawson grunted, spun around, and fell to the ground, clutching a bloody leg. Sheriff Brody stood at the bottom of the trail, a smoking rifle in his hand. Behind him were 4 deputized townsmen, including Mr. Henderson from the general store. "It's over, Creed," Brody yelled, his voice carrying on the morning air. "We heard the shooting. I've got a signed affidavit from one of your men we picked up down the trail. He decided his leg was worth more than his loyalty to you. He told us everything. The stampede, this attack, all of it." Creed's face went pale. He was trapped. He looked up at the rocks, where Dante was then at Jessamine's perch, and then down at the sheriff. The law had finally caught up to his family. With a primal scream of rage, he charged not at the sheriff, but up the hill toward the cabin, drawing his pistol, determined to destroy the evidence, to burn it all down. He never made it. Dante dropped from a ledge above him, landing as silently as a panther. He didn't use a weapon. He simply slammed into Creed, and the two men went down in a tangle of limbs. Dante's massive hands closed around Creed's throat, and for a second, Jessamine was sure she was about to witness a killing. But then Dante's eyes met hers across the distance. He saw her saw the rifle, saw the lawman below. He saw the world his father had believed, in a world of laws and justice, however flawed. With a shuddering breath, he loosened his grip. He would not become the monster they had always claimed he was. He hauled the gasping, defeated Creed to his feet and shoved him down the hill toward the waiting sheriff. As Brody clamped the irons on Bartholomew Creed's wrists, the town looked different. Mr. Henderson met Jessamine's gaze and gave her a slow, respectful nod. The other men looked up at Dante no longer with fear, but with a stunned, grudging admiration. Later that day, after the last of Creed's men had been rounded up, Jessamine and Dante stood on their porch, watching the sun set. The air was still peaceful. She held the original deed in her hand, the paper that had started it all. "It's yours," she said softly, holding it out to him. "All of it. Whisper Wind Mesa. The cabin. It's all Kane land." Dante looked not at the deed, but at her. He gently took her hand, the one not holding the paper, and folded her fingers over his. His touch was warm and firm. "Our land," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "Our home." She looked up at his face, at the gentle heart she had been the only one to see, and she knew her own heart had found its home as well. The bargain born of cruelty and desperation had led her to the truest and strongest love she had ever known. They were two outcasts who had found their place not in the world below, but with each other on the quiet mesa where the spirits of the mountain whispered their names on the wind. And so the story of Jessamine and Dante became a quiet legend in the Arizona Territory. It wasn't a tale of gunslingers or gold rushes, but of something far more rare and precious. It was a story of how courage can be found in the most desperate of bargains, and how love can bloom in the rockiest of soils. They showed an entire town that a person's worth is not measured by their blood or their reputation, but by the quiet strength of their character and the gentle truth of their heart. They rebuilt their home, reclaimed their legacy, and found in each other a world that was bigger and more beautiful than the one that had rejected them. If their story of courage and unexpected love moved you, please take a moment to honor their legacy. Hit that like button to let us know these stories matter. Share this video with someone who appreciates a tale of true grit and the wild, untamed heart of the West. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. We have so many more stories lost to the dust of time just waiting to be told. Thank you for listening.